Welcome to Island Crimes and Mysteries. And now, it's time to join your host Nules for another episode.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. Right guys, before we start today's episode, I would like to give a big shout out to my newest Patreon member, Sarah T, and welcome you on board. Thank you so much for your support. It's really, really appreciated. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my friends over on Rainy Day Rabbit Holes podcast, which is a Pacific Northwest history podcast. And if you haven't already checked them out, lads, go over there and check them out. They're really good. They're really funny. They're really witty. I've learned loads about the Pacific Northwest and all the cracker stories that are coming out of there. So, go over and give the girls a listen and a follow. I'm sure they'd be absolutely delighted to have you all on board. That's Rainy Day Rabbit Holes podcast. And finally, I'd like to tell you about my newest podcast that I'm doing with my co-host and friend, Mark. It's called "'Tis Just a Bit of Crack," and over there we're literally just having the crack. We have loads of kind of lighthearted and witty stuff, misheard lyrics. We do a pop culture corner where we'll be talking about all kinds of things like the 70s movies, 90s music, all that kind of stuff, celebrities, all that kind of crack. And we'll also be interviewing some celebrity guests. Our first episode is up already, and in that we're interviewing Rosala, who you probably remember, I'm sure you do, from the 1990s hit Everybody's Free. So yeah, go over and give us a listen. It's called "'Tis Just a Bit of Crack," and it does exactly what it says in the tin. We're just having a bit of fun and getting your weekends off to a great start. It's out every Friday at 7 p.m. So yeah, go over there and you'll see me in a whole more lighthearted vibe, I suppose. Yeah, okay. That's it. Let's get on with today's show. Today's case takes us to Ballincollig in County Cork. Ballincollig is a satellite town approximately 8 kilometres west of Cork City, with the River Lee running alongside the town. It became the largest town in County Cork in 2016, with a population of 18,621, which I'm sure has grown since then. Ballincollig Regional Park is the site of the former gunpowder mills, which is one of 3 such mills that manufactured gunpowder for the British government. Opening in 1794 before finally closing its doors in 1903. Many of the buildings still stand and are managed by Cork County Council and can be visited by the public. The famous Irish musician Rory Gallagher, often referred to as the greatest guitarist you never heard of, is also buried in Ballincollig. His headstone is a replica of an award he received in 1972 for International Guitarist of the Year. Musicians such as The Edge from U2 and Slash from Guns N' Roses cite Gallagher as their inspiration, and he is in 57th place in the Rolling Stones magazine's 100 Greatest Guitarists of All Time. Being a commuter town for Cork City, Ballincollig is a busy place. And it is here we would find 23-year-old Rachel Kiely living in the year 2000. The eldest of 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy, Rachel lived with her parents John and Rose and her 3 siblings on a housing estate, which was located close to the regional park. Rachel's parents were Jehovah Witnesses and very involved in the community. Rachel was also very involved in her local church and devoted to her faith. On finishing her leaving cert from Ballincollig Community School, Rachel pursued a career as a beautician. This decision was in part because it would afford her the time to do missionary work for her church. This was very important to Rachel, and she knew she needed to have a job that would give her the time to partake in that missionary work. That summer, after finishing her leaving cert, she went to Italy with her sister to work as an au pair, but would soon return home. Known as a quiet girl with a sweet nature, Rachel had many friends who were part of the Jehovah community, as was her boyfriend. Thursday, October the 26th, 2000 started out like any other day for Rachel. After finishing her day's work, she decided to take her 2 dogs for a walk in the nearby regional park. It was starting to get dark when Rachel set out on her walk, but Rachel was very familiar with the park as she regularly walked the dogs there. So it would not have even crossed her mind that she would be in any danger heading out that evening. She planned to do an hour's walk with the dogs and be back in time for her dinner. Her mother had prepared it for her as she had a Bible study meeting that evening. Then, approximately an hour after Rachel had left the house, her mother could hear a scratching noise coming from outside the door. When she went to investigate, she found the 2 family dogs scratching to get in, but no sign of Rachel. She immediately got a sinking feeling something was wrong. She called Rachel's sister Elizabeth, who was also in the house, and explained the situation to her, and they both headed up to the park to search for Rachel. They retraced her steps on the path they knew Rachel always took, but they could not find her. It was starting to get dark by now, and at 7 p.m, when Rachel still had not returned, the decision was made to contact the Gardaí. As well as alerting Gardaí, they also contacted other family members and her friends within the congregation at the Jehovah's Church. Everyone came out to search for Rachel. Rose went up to the local shop and bought flashlights for people, as it was so dark by now and parts of the park were not very well lit. It did not take long for what family and friends dreaded to become a reality, when a close family friend found Rachel. She was lying in some undergrowth just off the track she would have been walking on with her 2 dogs. Rachel was fully clothed, with her face down and in the fetal position, covered with branches and some undergrowth in a pathetic attempt to hide her body. It was clear from the get-go that Rachel had been attacked. Emergency services were immediately called, but unfortunately it was too late for Rachel. The area was sealed off as the investigation into Rachel's murder began, and a tent was erected around her remains to preserve any evidence until the state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, arrived. He would spend approximately 3 hours at the scene. The Garda Technical Bureau arrived and a thorough examination of the area commenced. Meanwhile, Gardaí also commenced door-to-door inquiries in the nearby area, and it was soon established, shortly afterwards, that the last time Rachel was seen was in the park at approximately 5:15 p.m. All the community, including her church, were in complete shock and devastated by what had happened. They couldn't understand how something this heinous had happened in their quite close-knit community. A spokesperson for her church saying they were all numb on hearing about her death. Rachel had been such an integral part of the church community. She'd even planned to preach with the church in the future. People began laying flowers near the spot where she had been found. After the post-mortem was carried out on Rachel's remains, her body was released to her family. The post-mortem determined Rachel had died from asphyxiation. Further tests would be needed to be carried out to determine exactly how she died, whether she had been smothered or strangled. It was later determined that Rachel had been strangled. On the 31st of October, Rachel was brought to the Witness Kingdom Hall in Cork for a service led by her uncle Max, which was attended by over 200 fellow Jehovah Witnesses, all there to support her family. Members of the church from around the country attended to give much needed support to the church community. After the service, Rachel was laid to rest at St. Oliver's Cemetery in Mahon. Prior to her funeral, Gardaí had appealed to people who may have been in the park that evening between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. to come forward, as any leads in the case were slow to come. A group of teenagers who were playing football only a mere 200 yards from where Rachel was found were also questioned. Gardaí were also trying to establish why Rachel was attacked. Was she mugged or was there a sexual motive? Despite the fact Rachel had been found fully clothed, Gardaí felt there was evidence that her clothes had been interfered with. Anyone in the area with sexual assault convictions was questioned, and Gardaí were anxious to speak to a group of teenage girls that were thought to be in the park around the time Rachel was attacked. They also wanted to speak to an elderly man who was believed to have been there too at the same time. Gardaí also collected CCTV from local businesses in the hope they would find some footage of significance on it. Then in early November, Gardaí began to collect DNA samples from people that were known to have been in the area at the time of the attack to compare the samples recovered from Rachel's clothes. More than 1,000 samples were collected, along with over 500 interviews having taken place. On the 7th of November, a reconstruction of Rachel's movements was televised on RTE's Crime Line. Then, 3 days later, on Friday the 10th of November, a breakthrough came. Gardaí stated they had arrested someone in relation to Rachel's death and they were being questioned following DNA results. Shockingly, it was then reported that the person who had been arrested was a 16-year-old male who had been picked up in Cork City that morning and brought to Granabraher Garda Station. He would appear before a special sitting of Cork District Court later that evening, where he was charged with the rape and murder of Rachel Kiely, to which he made no reply. The accused could not be named at the time because of his age, but information stated he was from the Ballincollig area. He was remanded in custody after the hearing to St Patrick's Juvenile Centre in Dublin. On the 4th of May 2002, his trial would begin in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, with a jury of 7 men and 5 women sworn in for the duration of the trial. First to take the stand was Rachel's mother, Rose. She recalled how the dogs had returned to the house without Rachel approximately an hour after she had left to bring them for a walk. She said she went with her daughter Elizabeth to the park around 6 p.m. to search for Rachel. She said Elizabeth said to her she thought she heard a scream as they called out Rachel's name while they were searching for her. Amazingly, she continued her story of what transpired by saying that they then came face to face with the accused and said hello to him as they recognised him from the area. Rose said she thought about asking him if he had seen Rachel, but decided she didn't want to come across as paranoid, so decided against saying anything to him. 4 friends of the accused then each took to the stand. They had met him at another friend's house at around 6:30 p.m, and they all said he was acting completely normal. They said they just sat around watching TV and chatting. None of them noticed anything different about his behaviour. They said they later went to the park to go on their motorbikes, but left shortly afterwards, with the accused actually abandoning his bike there, as it had neither tax nor insurance. They left because of all the Gardaí in the park. Next to take the stand was Dr. Harbison, the state pathologist. He said he felt she had been targeted, probably chased, attacked and then dragged to where she was later found, as he felt the positioning of her body was not a natural position. He felt she had been strangled in a different area and she was placed in the fetal position in the area she was found after being moved there after the initial attack. He said there was no evidence of sexual injury, but he did state that her clothing had been disturbed. Hair and saliva samples had been taken from the accused, but he refused to give a blood sample, citing a fear of needles as his excuse. Forensic scientist Dr. Maureen Smith recalled on the stand that she had collected fibres from Rachel's fleece jacket that matched fibres taken from a jumper that was removed from the accused's bedroom the day he was arrested. Fibres collected from other items of clothing belonging to Rachel matched fibres from a hat belonging to the accused, which he had been wearing and had left with his motorbike at the park. Semen samples taken from the 16-year-old also matched semen found on Rachel's clothing, including her underwear. Dr. Smith stated the chances of this DNA sample belonging to someone else was 1 in 16 billion. There was a bit of drama during Dr. Smith's cross-examination when it was thought that one of the jurors had actually fallen asleep. But after a guarantee from the foreman of the jury that this had not been the case, the trial continued. Then the defence tried to challenge Dr. Smith's testimony on the DNA evidence, saying that the test tubes that were used to collect the samples were not sealed properly, saying that there was a probability that these samples could have been contaminated, but did say it would have had to have been done intentionally. It was made clear that all the samples given from the public were blood samples and that the only ones that were for saliva were from the accused. The accused's mother took to the stand in his defence on the 12th of June. She stated she didn't believe he would have anything to do with such a heinous crime. She went on to say that the Gardaí had called to their house during their door-to-door inquiries, which had panicked her son, as he had been in the park with his friends that evening. But she said he was worried about being in trouble for not having his bike taxed and insured and not for the murder. She said he had been told that such an offence could give him 3 years in prison, and he was so worried he had decided to leave the area. His mother saying she had talked him out of it, as it would have looked suspicious if he had left so soon after Rachel's death. It never seemed to occur to her that he would have had a more sinister reason for wanting to leave. But nevertheless, she was convinced of his innocence. Then it was his father's turn to take to the stand. He spoke about how his son left school at 14 as the school felt it was for the best. He said he excelled at sport and had medals to prove it. He said he was also a good Gaelic footballer and felt that if he had been given the opportunity, he could have went on to play for Cork. He said that his son had come from a stable background, was one of 4 children and grew up in a good area. Then it was time for the accused to take to the stand. He said he knew Rachel to see and that he had gone to school with one of her brothers. He said he had called to his girlfriend of 2 years' workplace to collect her the evening of Rachel's death. He said Gardaí had called to his house the week before the murder to issue him with a warning as he had been caught dangerous driving on his motorbike, and went on to say that it was the Gardaí that had actually told him he would get 3 years if he was caught again. This did not deter him all the same, as he was back out on his motorbike the very next day. But he stated it was the reason he had abandoned his bike in the park that night. He was afraid he would get done and get the 3 years. He planned to run away, he said, as he knew the Gardaí would find the bike in the park. He explained he had met his friends at 5 p.m. in the park that day after work, and that they had gone to his friend's house about 10 minutes after meeting up. He had to then admit returning to the park at 5:20 p.m, as he had been spotted by his former babysitter who had met him there at about 5:30, and she had given evidence to that effect. He concurred with his friend's evidence that they had left the park at around 6:30 p.m. to go to the house and watch TV, and then they returned to the park at 8 p.m. and subsequently abandoned his motorbike after seeing all the Gardaí in the park. He went on to admit that he had planned on running away after the Gardaí had called to his home 2 days after the murder. He said he had tried to get away, but as the Guinness Jazz Festival was on in the city that very weekend, he could get no public transport and had no choice but to stay. He then admitted to lying about his movements when he had been initially questioned. He recalled the last time he had seen Rachel was over a month before, and he had never had any close contact with her. Finally, closing arguments began with the defence accusing the prosecution of being blinded by science, with them reminding the jury of what had happened to the Birmingham Six, stating it was always a possibility for DNA evidence to be incorrect and misleading. The prosecution countered by saying the accused's parents had allegedly lied in the witness stand in a vain attempt to protect their son. They also accused them of trying to help him flee the country and go to his uncle who lived in the UK. His uncle too had a checkered past, having served time in prison for a serious crime. After both sides had successfully argued their cases, the jury was supposed to retire for deliberation. But one juror sent a note to the judge saying that they were finding it hard to concentrate, as they were meant to have been at a wedding that day. After apologising to the juror for what he described as a longer than normal trial, the judge put off deliberations until the following Monday. Then, on the Tuesday, the 18th of June, after deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. By a majority of 10-2, the now 17-year-old defendant was found guilty of murdering Rachel Kiely. He received a mandatory life sentence for the charge. He was also found guilty of rape, but this sentence was deferred until a later date. An application to appeal was denied. On turning 18 a few days after the 7-week trial, the media released the name of the accused. But I choose not to hear on this podcast, as this podcast is about Rachel and not him. He had turned the Kielys' life upside down and changed their lives from one of peace and happiness into a complete nightmare. Adding to the fact he was a local and lived near them, and they knew him to see as well as his family. It was going to make life extremely difficult for an already traumatised family, potentially having to pass his family members in the street every day. So the Kielys made the decision to move from the area not long after Rachel's funeral. Their whole lives uprooted because of the devastating actions of a 16-year-old teenager. It beggars belief, really, that at this young age, that's how your mind functions. On the 22nd of November 2002, he was again before the court to be sentenced for the sexual assault on Rachel. For this, he received a 10-year sentence, which was going to run concurrently with his life sentence. And any potential for an appeal was denied. Concurrently means that the 10-year sentence would be served at the same time as his life sentence. I'm sure we all have an opinion on the point of even convicting someone and sentencing them to a period of time that effectively is no extra time at all, as it is served alongside the original sentence. It just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem like a punishment for the crime that has been committed. Then in January 2006, this convicted killer applied for leave to appeal. The argument put forward by his legal team was that the judge's direction to the jury had been misdirected and misleading, saying that he should have been clearer in his direction by advising the jury that forensics is not an exact science, and that semen can survive outside the body for days. So effectively, they were saying it may not have been from the night of the murder the semen had come in contact with Rachel's clothing. The Court of Criminal Appeal agreed with the arguments put forth by his legal team, and unbelievably his conviction was overturned. He was out on bail and a retrial ordered. Right there, all I can think of is Rachel's poor family. Have they not been through enough? This trial would begin in February of 2006. The accused pleaded not guilty to the rape and murder of Rachel Kiely. Instead, he pleaded guilty to her manslaughter, but counsel for the state did not accept his plea. The same witnesses, with the exception of the accused, gave their evidence on the stand as they had before. Dr. John Harbison, who had carried out the post-mortem and who by this stage was suffering from Alzheimer's and could not take the stand, had his testimony delivered by the then state pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy after she had extensively studied the case. Her conclusion was that Rachel had died from asphyxiation after probably being held in an arm lock around her neck, which ultimately led to cardiac arrest and her subsequent death. Deliberations began again on the 9th of March and lasted 3 hours before the jury was sent home. They returned the following day, which was a Friday, to continue deliberations. After 4 hours, they returned with their verdict. The accused was found guilty of rape, but not guilty of murder, instead being found guilty of manslaughter. Rachel's distraught family decided against any impact statement, probably too upset by the outcome of this trial. He was sentenced to 8 years for Rachel's manslaughter, with 6 years suspended. The judge citing the fact that he had already served 4.5 years, his age at the time of the murder, and the fact he had no previous convictions, effectively meaning he could be out of prison in 18 months. The consternation among the wider public at the light sentence imposed for such a vicious and heinous act was palpable. Rachel's family were obviously distraught that their daughter and sister's life meant so little. Rachel had no second chance at life. She was the innocent victim. An appeal was launched immediately by the DPP as they too were of the opinion that the sentence was far too lenient. The prosecution appeared before the Court of Appeal on the 19th of April 2007 to attempt to have his sentence increased. In Ireland, you can only convict someone of murder if you can prove that there was deliberate attempt to seriously harm or kill, where the accused demonstrated mens rea, or in other words, criminal intent. If this can't be proven, a conviction of manslaughter is applied. In manslaughter, you have voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. Voluntary is where a killing takes place, which would ordinarily be classified as murder, but where there are excusing circumstances like provocation, self-defence, or diminished responsibility. Involuntary manslaughter is where there is an unlawful or dangerous act committed or gross negligence which results in the death of someone, but without any intention to kill or seriously harm that person. The DPP's appeal was heard by 3 judges who agreed with the findings that the sentence was far too lenient, and instead the accused was handed a 12-year concurrent sentence for each offence, with time served deducted, which gave him another 3 years onto his sentence. He was also placed on the sex offenders register. This, I'm sure, gave Rachel's family some relief. Then, in November 2007, he was again before the courts for an armed robbery he had committed in 2005 whilst out on bail before his retrial for Rachel's murder. He had entered a post office in Cork with a weapon and attacked an elderly couple and their son before making off in the elderly couple's son's car with €1,500 and lottery scratch cards. He gave €950 of this money to his girlfriend after telling her it was money from a credit union loan he had taken out. The car he had made his escape in was found with the weapon he had used, which subsequently had his DNA on it. This trial lasted a week and he was found guilty on all charges and handed an 8-year sentence and a further 3-year sentence for the theft of the car. This, again, was to run concurrently with his 8-year sentence. He was banned from driving for 10 years. He was to begin this sentence in 2010 after he had completed his sentence for Rachel's killing. Again, he appealed the sentence, which he won, as it was stated by his legal team that the Gardaí did not have a valid warrant to search his home, making his conviction unsafe. On retrial in June 2010, he pleaded guilty to the robbery and theft of the car and was sentenced to 4 years. Again, the DPP appealed this sentence, but would be unsuccessful this time around. After getting into strife in prison for beating up another inmate, he was released a few months later and moved in with his girlfriend. He was again in court in 2015 for a 2013 shooting of a man in Limerick with a shotgun. He was found not guilty on this occasion. In November 2013, he robbed a shop in Limerick, but the shopkeeper defended his premises and he ran away, leaving his scarf behind him. DNA from the scarf led straight to his door, and in 2015 he was again found guilty of the robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 1 year suspended. Over the coming years, he was in and out of prison for more robberies and drug seizures at his home. He went on the run and scarpered to the UK, which made him in breach of his bail. As he was on the sex offenders list, Gardaí had to be aware of where he lived at all times. Eventually, he was located and was brought back to court in June of 2018, where he was sentenced to a further 2.5 years, with the last 6 months suspended. In December 2018, he received a further 6-year sentence with 2 years suspended for another robbery and was due for release in 2022. He was only out when he attacked a woman in her 60s with a hammer and a man in his 20s, leaving him in a critical condition requiring brain surgery. He was in court in 2022 for these offences and his trial took place in 2023, where he was found guilty. A sentence of 15 years was suggested by the prosecution in lieu of the serious nature of the attack. In June of 2023, he was sentenced to 8.5 years. On appeal by the state, this sentence was increased to 11 years in March of 2024, the judge stating that there was no scope for any part of it to be reduced to encourage rehabilitation. And I think we can safely say, from all the repeated offences by this perpetrator, that the chances of rehabilitation for him are slim to none. If he was to see the error of his ways, he would have made some effort to turn towards a path to redemption. He showed no remorse for what he did to Rachel and by extension to her family and friends. He continued to disrespect her memory by continuing his criminal lifestyle and inflicting pain and suffering on others. Should our justice system be so lenient on these types of people? Some would argue if he had got a life, meaning whole life sentence for Rachel's murder, would all the other victims have been spared? And would it have brought some modicum of peace to the Kiely family, knowing he could never hurt anyone again? Whatever our thoughts are on the justice system here in Ireland, for today, or whenever you may be listening to this podcast, and from wherever you're listening, I would ask that for these few moments, let your thoughts be for the people who are most important in this story. And that's Rachel and her family and her wide circle of friends. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.
You've been listening to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Join Nules for another episode, coming real soon. And keep up to date by following our social media sites, our YouTube channel, and our website, irelandcrimesandmysteries.ie.